The moment I got the call saying someone from the neighborhood HOA had taped an eviction warning to my disabled grandmother's front door, my entire body locked up in disbelief, because this wasn't some abandoned property or late payment. This was my grandma Evelyn's home, the place she had quietly lived in for almost 30 years while surviving surgeries, mobility problems, and the kind of loneliness older people rarely talk about out loud. Even crazier, the person pushing this mess was apparently one of those power-hungry HOA board members who acted like a suburban dictator every time somebody's mailbox leaned 3 inches too far to the left. Bro, hearing the details later absolutely blew my mind, because this woman honestly thought she could bully a disabled elderly woman into leaving property she believed nobody would defend. What she didn't know, and this part still feels unreal, was that one tiny legal detail changed everything. The land underneath her precious HOA neighborhood legally belonged to me, and once I realized what was happening, everything escalated fast. Dude, my name is Mason Reed, and before any of this happened, I honestly thought neighborhood HOA drama was the kind of thing people exaggerated online for entertainment. You know the stories. Someone gets angry over grass length, mailbox paint, holiday decorations staying up too long, and suddenly an entire suburban civil war breaks out over absolutely nothing. I used to hear those stories and think, there is no way real adults spend this much energy creating chaos over things that barely matter. Turns out I was spectacularly wrong, because what happened to my grandmother Evelyn made every HOA horror story sound tame. Grandma Evelyn lived in a quiet little planned community called Willow Creek Estates, one of those neighborhoods built around the promise of community harmony, polished sidewalks, matching landscaping, and overly dramatic newsletters reminding residents about approved flower colors. Like the future of civilization somehow depended on hydrangeas staying coordinated. The place looked peaceful from the outside. Clean driveways, trimmed bushes, tiny decorative ponds nobody used, and signs every few hundred feet reminding residents about neighborhood standards as if they were entering a private kingdom. Now, here's where things get important. Grandma wasn't rich, not even close. She lived carefully, stretched every dollar, and somehow still managed to spoil everyone around her despite being the one person who probably deserved spoiling herself. She had mobility issues after multiple surgeries and mostly used a wheelchair on bad days, though she still stubbornly insisted on using a cane whenever she wanted to prove she was perfectly capable. That woman had more pride than anyone I've ever met. Even after years of health problems, she still baked terrible cookies every Christmas and somehow convinced everyone they tasted amazing just because she smiled. While handing them over, she lived alone after Grandpa passed, and naturally, I checked on her constantly. What made everything weird was that Grandma technically didn't own her house outright, in the traditional HOA sense. See, decades ago, my grandfather invested in a weird land agreement during a development expansion. Long story short, he quietly bought and retained ownership rights to a section of land before the HOA was formally reorganized and expanded. Most people never notice because paperwork around property easements and leased parcels is incredibly boring unless someone suddenly decides to start a legal war. After Grandpa passed away, ownership transferred into a family trust and eventually into my name, meaning this entire pristine neighborhood. The houses were privately owned by residents, sure, but sections of common use property and several foundational land parcels beneath neighborhood access zones legally set under ownership structures connected to me. Did I think about this often? Absolutely not. Bro, I work in commercial property management. I spend enough time reading contracts and zoning documents already. The last thing I wanted to do after work was think about old family land holdings hidden inside HOA bureaucracy. Honestly, most months I forgot Willow Creek even existed outside of Grandma living there. And because everything looked calm, I assumed things were fine. That assumption lasted until one Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting at work, drowning in emails, when Grandma called. Now, Grandma never called during business hours unless something mattered. At first, she sounded oddly calm, which somehow made things worse. She explained that someone from the HOA had come by again. Again. That word immediately got my attention. Apparently, over the previous few months, The HOA had started issuing citations against her for increasingly ridiculous reasons. Her flower pots weren't uniform. For her wheelchair access ramp supposedly violated visual aesthetics. Her porch furniture looked aged. A small wind chime violated sound policies. Our grass near the mailbox was inconsistent. And the kicker, a complaint had allegedly been filed because medical transportation vehicles parked too frequently near her property. I remember physically leaning back in my chair thinking, hold on, what? That was the first moment where alarm bells really started going off, because normal HOA nonsense is annoying, but targeting accessibility accommodations? That feels different. That feels personal. Grandma tried brushing it off. She said she didn't want me starting trouble, which immediately told me things were worse than she admitted. That woman avoids conflict like it's contagious. So when someone pushes her enough to quietly sound defeated, yeah, that bothered me. I drove over after work. The moment I arrived, I noticed something strange. Her front porch looked emptier. Way emptier. Gone were her flower arrangements. Gone was the little bench Grandpa built. Gone were decorative pieces she'd had for years. Even the wind chime disappeared. I walked inside and found Grandma sitting quietly at the kitchen table. And man, I hate saying this, but she looked embarrassed though. That hit me harder than anger at first, because nobody should make an elderly disabled woman feel ashamed for existing comfortably inside her own home. Turns out she'd started removing things voluntarily after repeated warnings. Apparently, a particular HOA board member kept visiting, a woman named Patricia Holloway, and according to Grandma, Patricia had developed an obsession. Every interaction followed the same pattern. She'd arrive smiling politely at first, mention neighborhood standards, then slowly slide into intimidation disguised as professionalism. Repeated reminders, escalating notices, talk about compliance, talk about preserving property values, 5 subtle comments about whether independent living was still practical. Yeah. D. Maya Naiko by T. Read that sentence again, because hearing it made my jaw clench. Someone had essentially implied my disabled grandmother maybe shouldn't be living there anymore, and over flower pots, over ramps, over aging patio furniture. That's exactly how some people act in real life when tiny power goes straight to their heads. Grandma handed me a stack of notices. I read every single one, and the deeper I got, the uglier things looked. Violation notices, fine threats, maintenance demands, warnings about escalating enforcement. Then I found the one that changed everything. And notice labeled Occupancy Compliance Review, corporate-sounding language designed to sound harmless. But hidden inside legal wording sat a sentence implying residency review procedures could result in forced relocation recommendations if homeowners failed ongoing compliance obligations. Excuse me. Forced relocation? Over landscaping? Over accessibility accommodations? Bro, hearing this still makes me mad. Because it wasn't really about rules anymore. It felt like pressure. Like someone betting that an elderly woman living alone would eventually surrender. I asked Grandma why she hadn't told me sooner. She hesitated, then quietly admitted something that honestly wrecked me for a second. She thought she was becoming a burden. Apparently, Patricia had repeatedly framed complaints around community disruption and special exceptions. Special exceptions? Imagine hearing that when you already struggle physically. Imagine being told, politely and repeatedly, that your existence inconveniences neighbors. And that kind of psychological pressure wears people down. Especially older people. Especially lonely people. And that was the moment this story stopped being neighborhood annoyance and became personal. I asked who exactly Patricia Holloway thought she was. Grandma sighed and explained. 6. Patricia had joined the HOA board about 2 years earlier after moving into Willow Creek. According to neighbors, she immediately started reshaping policies, policing aesthetics, and acting like she personally owned the community. She loved rules, loved authority, loved reminding people she sat on the board. Apparently, she even walked around photographing houses. Who does that voluntarily? That level of energy aimed at controlling bushes and paint shades genuinely amazes me. But here's the thing. Even then, I still tried being reasonable. I assume maybe there have been misunderstanding. Maybe rogue paperwork. Maybe over-enthusiastic enforcement. So I emailed the HOA requesting clarification. Professional, calm, documented. I introduced myself as Evelyn Reed's grandson and legal representative for certain trust matters associated with the property. No threats, no drama, just clarification. The response arrived the next morning. And wow, cold, dismissive, almost arrogant. Generic legal wording, repeated references to compliance, references to preserving community standards, warnings that failure to cooperate could accelerate enforcement, no acknowledgement of disability accommodations, no apology, nothing. Then came the line that genuinely made me pause. The email implied ownership structures tied to legacy parcel agreements carried no operational authority over HOA decisions. Interesting wording, very interesting wording, because that sentence told me something important. Patricia knew enough to know land agreements existed, but apparently not enough to understand what they actually meant. And suddenly my property management brain started waking up, because if someone confidently misstates legal authority, they usually haven't read the documents. They're bluffing. So that evening, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled the old files, trust agreements, recorded plats, development contracts, 7 access easements, foundational parcel maps, stacks of dusty legal paperwork my grandfather carefully preserved like hidden treasure. Nobody appreciated. I spread everything across my dining table. Hours passed. Coffee disappeared. Sticky notes multiplied. And slowly, one very funny picture started forming. Willow Creek HOA operated under agreements requiring least use permissions connected to land my family trust still controlled. Not symbolic ownership. Not honorary, actual enforceable ownership interests. Parking access. Common pathways. Maintenance permissions. Storm drainage easements. Clubhouse ingress. And shared use land underneath several operational areas. Legally speaking, the HOA functioned partly because long-standing agreements remained active. Agreements now controlled by me. I literally sat there staring at paperwork, laughing in disbelief, because Patricia Holloway had spent months terrorizing my disabled grandmother while standing on land she effectively needed my permission to govern. That realization? Absolutely unbelievable, but I still wasn't rushing into war. Not yet. I wanted facts. I wanted evidence. I wanted patience, because revenge hits harder when paperwork does the talking. Still, deep down, something had shifted. I visited Grandma again the next evening. She looked exhausted, and sitting taped to her front door sat a fresh notice. Bright red lettering, aggressive formatting, final compliance review, language threatening occupancy action, basically designed to scare someone into submission. Bro, the second I peeled that paper off her door, something inside me snapped. Not explosive anger, something colder, more organized. Because in property disputes, emotions lose, documentation wins, and Patricia Holloway had just made a catastrophic mistake. She thought she was intimidating an elderly woman with nobody protecting her. What she actually did, she woke up the legal owner of the ground underneath her HOA's carefully curated little empire. And for the first time, I started wondering exactly how far malicious compliance could really go. The next few days turned into something that felt less like neighborhood drama and more like a slow-motion legal avalanche nobody except me could see coming. I wish I could say I stormed into Willow Creek Estates breathing fire and immediately started dismantling Patricia Holloway's little kingdom. But real revenge, especially property revenge, almost never works like that. Real revenge moves quietly at first. It studies paperwork. It notices inconsistencies. It waits for arrogance to expose weak foundations. And trust me, arrogance was overflowing in this situation. After seeing that aggressive compliance notice taped to Grandma Evelyn's door, I stopped viewing everything as isolated harassment and started treating it like evidence. Every citation went into folders. Every timestamp got documented. Every maintenance warning, every suspicious complaint, every strangely formal letter dripping with intimidation language became part of a growing timeline. Working in property management teaches you something people rarely appreciate. Organizations that weaponize bureaucracy almost always leave fingerprints. They get overconfident, they write too much, they accidentally document their own bad behavior. That realization honestly gave me chills because Patricia and the HOA had apparently been creating a paper trail against themselves for months. Grandma, meanwhile, kept trying to minimize everything. And that part genuinely frustrated me because older people, especially independent older people, sometimes absorb mistreatment quietly just to avoid becoming difficult. She had started changing little parts of her daily routine to avoid complaints. She parked medical transport farther away. 9. She removed decorations she loved. She even hesitated before scheduling mobility support appointments because she worried neighbors were getting tired of disruptions. So, hearing that made my stomach twist. That's exactly how pressure tactics work in real life. Nobody screams, nobody physically forces anything. Instead, someone slowly makes another person feel unwelcome until they start shrinking themselves voluntarily. Bro, realizing that was happening to my grandmother honestly lit a fire in me. I began spending more evenings inside Willow Creek, partly to check on Grandma and partly to observe. And wow, the neighborhood vibe suddenly looked very different once I paid attention. At first glance, everything still looked polished, organized, peaceful, but underneath that polished suburban aesthetic sat tension. Residents lowered voices when HOA topics came up. People glanced around before complaining. One older couple quietly admitted they paid fines they didn't understand simply because fighting sounded exhausting. Another homeowner mentioned patio inspections happening with bizarre frequency. Somebody else had removed garden seating after receiving repeated appearance recommendations, and suddenly the picture became obvious. Patricia hadn't just been bothering Grandma. She had built a culture of quiet intimidation. The strangest part was how performative it all felt. Patricia apparently loved appearances. Residents described carefully staged neighborhood walks where she photographed minor violations like she was documenting crimes against civilization, slight discoloration on fences, decorative stones outside approved color palettes, storage bins visible for too many hours, tiny things transformed into dramatic concerns about community integrity. Hearing stories like that genuinely made me laugh in disbelief because imagine waking up every day voluntarily searching for reasons to micromanage strangers. Then some people really discover tiny authority and treat it like a royal title. Still, I resisted acting emotionally. Instead, I filed requests. Quiet ones, professional ones, requests for governing documents, updated enforcement policies, meeting records, financial disclosures, the architectural compliance standards, maintenance, jurisdiction maps. Nothing dramatic, nothing threatening, just paperwork. And suddenly something funny happened. Responses slowed, emails became awkwardly vague, administrative language grew strangely defensive. That shift told me everything. Because competent organizations answer documentation requests calmly, bad actors panic when somebody actually reads things. Late one evening, while digging through archived county filings, I found the first truly incredible piece of information. Willow Creek's clubhouse parking area sat partially across trust-controlled easement land tied to my grandfather's old development agreement. Then came pathway access, then drainage systems, then shared maintenance routes, every discovery stacked higher. Patricia clearly believed the HOA stood independently above residents, untouchable and absolute, but legally speaking, the organization leaned on agreements it barely seemed to understand. Bro, hearing stories about karma always sounds dramatic online until paperwork starts revealing hidden trapdoors. I remember physically laughing alone at my kitchen table because the situation became absurd. This woman had spent months threatening occupancy reviews against my disabled grandmother while serving on a board dependent on land agreements signed by my family decades earlier. That level of accidental irony deserved an award. Still, I kept things controlled. No dramatic confrontation, no legal threats, just observation. Then came the neighborhood meeting. 11. Apparently, HOA board meetings happened monthly at the clubhouse, and Grandma mentioned Patricia had encouraged attendance after recent community concerns. That wording alone sounded suspicious enough to make me interested. So I went, and wow, the energy inside that room felt weird immediately. You know those environments where people pretend everything is normal while tension quietly hangs over everyone? Exactly that. Residents sat stiffly. Board members carried folders like tiny bureaucratic shields. Patricia stood near the front, wearing the expression of someone deeply committed to enjoying authority. Even before anything officially started, she projected the kind of confidence people develop when nobody has seriously challenged them in a while. Everything revolved around compliance, maintenance, community image, neighborhood discipline. Again and again, conversations subtly drifted toward preserving standards. And hidden underneath all of it sat something uglier, social pressure, the idea that residents who created inconvenience somehow threatened collective harmony. That phrase kept resurfacing. Community harmony? Bro, hearing sanitized language like that while knowing Grandma had been pressured over mobility accommodations nearly made me laugh from disbelief. Because once you notice manipulation, it becomes impossible to unsee. Then came references to occupancy concerns. And not names, not directly, but implications, mentions of homes requiring appropriate maintenance capabilities, discussions around resident suitability for independent compliance. I sat there thinking, wow, this is actually happening. Nobody said Grandma's name, but the target felt painfully obvious. And the room silence somehow felt worse than open hostility. People looked uncomfortable. Nobody challenged it. That's another thing power structures thrive on, exhausted silence. 12. Afterward, I calmly requested copies of meeting records and compliance authority references tied to enforcement procedures. Nothing aggressive, just professional. The reaction, immediate discomfort. Patricia reportedly shifted tone fast. Suddenly formal, suddenly guarded, suddenly extremely interested in procedure. Interesting. Very interesting. Because predators love ambiguity until somebody starts asking specific questions. The following morning brought the escalation I genuinely think Patricia later regretted most. A certified notice arrived at Grandma's house. Heavier wording, bigger consequences, references to legal review, potential occupancy enforcement recommendations, community non-compliance, and tucked inside sat language implying legal standing to remove residents under persistent violations. That was the moment patients stopped being passive. Because intimidation aimed at a disabled elderly woman crossed into territory I wasn't willing to politely observe. I contacted specialists, land use attorneys, property compliance consultants, dust administrators, not because I needed permission, but because documentation matters. You verify before moving, and what came back honestly stunned even me. Multiple professionals independently confirmed what I suspected. The HOA's operational authority heavily depended on access agreements connected to trust land, agreements containing renewal and compliance conditions. Conditions, plural, meaning there were obligations, meaning leverage existed, meaning Patricia's perfect suburban power structure suddenly looked far shakier than she imagined. At that point, revenge stopped feeling emotional. It became procedural. Malicious compliance energy entered the chat in the funniest way possible. I started reading every line of every agreement exactly as written. Maintenance requirements, insurance obligations, land usage terms, notification procedures, unauthorized modifications. 13. Improper governance exposure. Turns out, Willow Creek may have been very enthusiastic about enforcing flower pot rules while appearing remarkably casual about obligations tied to land agreements. That realization genuinely blew my mind, because the same organization harassing Grandma for aesthetics looked suspiciously careless where actual legal compliance mattered. And then came the discovery that changed everything. Buried deep in maintenance records and easement filings sat evidence of unauthorized modifications near a shared pathway expansion approved years earlier. Small detail, huge consequence, because technically permission should have been requested. Permission from whom? Yeah. The Danny and Miney. Well, Danny Brakal. Nace Ace. Mace? Danny? You? Me? The silence in my house after realizing that felt unreal. I just sat there staring at papers thinking Patricia really has no idea what kind of storm she accidentally built. Meanwhile, Grandma still worried she was causing trouble, which somehow made me more determined. Nobody should spend their final years feeling like an inconvenience inside the home they love. Nobody should quietly remove pieces of themselves because a neighborhood bully disguises intimidation as policy. That part kept replaying in my head every night. By then, something colder had settled into place. Not precision, because property revenge hits differently. You don't scream, you don't threaten. You simply follow every rule more carefully than the people abusing them. And Patricia Holloway had just unknowingly handed me the blueprint for exactly that. By the time everything finally shifted from quiet preparation into open retaliation, I had accumulated enough documentation to fill several binders, 3 cloud folders, 2 external backups, and what honestly looked like the organizational system of someone preparing for a courtroom documentary. That sounds dramatic, but property disputes become weirdly intense once you realize how much power hides inside forgotten agreements. 14, Patricia Holloway still thought she was running a clean little suburban operation built on neighborhood authority and polished intimidation. Meanwhile, I was sitting on decades of contracts, recorded easements, trust conditions, maintenance obligations, and enough legal leverage to make even experienced property managers pause for a second and say, well, this escalated. The funniest part was that Patricia clearly believed she had momentum. Grandma Evelyn kept receiving notices, not constant, but consistent enough to maintain pressure. Fresh reminders about porch aesthetics, questions about visual consistency, letters politely suggesting accessibility equipment created neighborhood disharmony. Every sentence somehow managed to sound professional while quietly feeling cruel. That combination still blows my mind because there's something uniquely disturbing about people hiding bad behavior inside polite language. Instead of arguing back, though, I changed strategy. Documentation became action. I submitted formal written requests to the HOA board regarding enforcement transparency, accommodation standards, procedural authority, and governance compliance. Every request was professionally formatted. Every email referenced specific clauses. Every question carried citations. No accusations, no emotional language, just calm precision. That shift immediately changed the energy. Responses slowed again. Board members suddenly stopped sounding confident. Language became vague. Patricia apparently started avoiding specifics, and right there I knew pressure had started working, because people who actually understand authority rarely panic when asked to explain it. And then came the first move. Small, and quiet, absolutely devastating. I sent a formal trust review notice regarding easement compliance. Not a threat, a review, a very important distinction. 15, the document simply stated that following updated trust oversight procedures, land use obligations tied to Willow Creek Estates would undergo operational evaluation to ensure compliance with long-standing agreements. Professional, neutral, and completely legal. Bro, the reaction of immediate chaos. Apparently, HOA leadership spent days scrambling. Residents later told me Patricia suddenly started calling emergency meetings. Board emails increased. People whispered about lawyers, and nobody understood why, which honestly made the situation even funnier because nobody except a handful of professionals realized what was happening. Imagine terrorizing residents over mailbox paint and suddenly discovering somebody quietly owns leverage over your parking access and maintenance permissions. That realization must have landed like a meteor. Still, I stay patient. Patience matters because revenge built on paperwork gets stronger the longer arrogance keeps talking. A week later, I attended another HOA meeting. This time, the atmosphere felt completely different. Tense, nervous, quiet. Patricia still carried herself confidently, but something underneath looked shaky, like someone trying very hard to appear in control while privately panicking. And wow, hearing her pivot tone in real time genuinely amazed me. Suddenly, meetings focused on community understanding, constructive relationships, transparency, interesting words for someone who spent months harassing disabled residents. That's exactly how people act once consequences start entering a room. Then came the moment that almost made me laugh out loud. Patricia casually mentioned legal confidence. Something about the HOA possessing full authority over occupancy and compliance standards. Bro, well, I nearly choked because I had county filings sitting in my folder, quietly disagreeing with her entire personality. Again, though I stayed calm. No dramatic reveal. No speeches. 16. Instead, after the meeting, I politely submitted another request. Copies of enforcement authority related specifically to occupancy procedures, documentation supporting disability accommodation handling, board approvals for escalation standards, and one tiny additional request, verification of approvals concerning modifications affecting trust easement zones, and that last sentence, nuclear level polite, because I already knew approval records didn't exist. Watching the energy shift was honestly incredible. Board members reportedly became visibly uncomfortable, and emails slowed even more. Then silence. Complete silence. For nearly a week. And then, because apparently Patricia believed escalation still worked, Grandma received another certified notice. I wish I were joking. This one used heavier wording than anything prior, language implying legal review and occupancy enforcement timelines. Nothing explicit enough to sound outrageous, but enough to scare an elderly person living alone. Again, that part made something inside me go cold, because at some point incompetence stops being funny. At some point, cruelty wrapped in bureaucracy deserves consequences, so I moved officially the trust legal representative sent notice requesting immediate clarification of land use compliance under historical agreements and temporary suspension review of certain permissions pending verification. Still calm, still professional, still entirely legal, but suddenly things got very real. Parking access concerns emerged, shared maintenance obligations entered review, insurance verification requests appeared, pathway compliance questions surfaced, nothing removed, nothing threatened, just reviewed, malicious compliance at its finest. Because if an HOA loves rules, then perfect. Let's follow every single one. Bro, hearing updates during that period genuinely felt surreal. Neighbors started noticing unusual contractor visits. 17 board members looked stressed. Patricia reportedly became short-tempered. Rumors spread fast. Something about land disputes. Something about easements. Something about legal complications. Nobody knew details. Meanwhile, Grandma just sat in her kitchen confused, asking why neighborhood people suddenly looked nervous around her mailbox. That image still makes me laugh. Poor woman had no clue she accidentally became the center of suburban chaos, and for the first time in months, she started smiling again. Small smile, but real because notices slowed, then stopped. Interesting timing, and very interesting timing. Apparently, intimidation loses momentum once paperwork pushes back. Still, I wasn't finished. Not even close. Because buried inside months of harassment sat one detail I couldn't ignore. Patricia had made Grandma feel unsafe in her own home. That deserved accountability, not cruelty, not humiliation, accountability. So I requested a full compliance audit tied to trust access obligations, everything, drainage maintenance, shared structures, modification approvals, landscape encroachment, parking easements, liability procedures, and insurance updates. community pathway obligations, and wow, the findings, messy. Like genuinely messy. Missing approvals, expired maintenance filings, unauthorized landscaping modifications, structural changes requiring review, inconsistent documentation, procedural shortcuts. Suddenly, the HOA, obsessed with perfect lawns, looked astonishingly relaxed about actual compliance. That irony practically wrote itself. I remember staring at one report whispering, "You harassed my disabled grandmother over flower pots while forgetting to maintain required legal records." Incredible, absolutely incredible. But the biggest reveal came late one night after another, a document review. A clubhouse access expansion completed years earlier crossed trust use territory without recorded authorization. 18 minor issue visually, massive issue legally, because technically oversight review could require renegotiation. Not destruction, not punishment, just review, and apparently review terrified people. Within days, Patricia finally reached out, first indirectly, and then formally, suddenly polite, suddenly collaborative, suddenly deeply interested in working together. Bro, that tonal shift, legendary. 1 month earlier, Grandma supposedly disrupted community standards. Now, everyone wanted cooperation. Funny how quickly arrogance transforms into diplomacy once leverage appears. Still, I said almost nothing. Professional responses only. Documentation, compliance, clarification, meeting schedules. No emotion, no speeches, no victory laps. Just procedure, because property revenge works best when the paperwork embarrasses people without you raising your voice. And Patricia Holloway still hadn't realized the worst part yet. And she thought this was negotiation. She thought she could smooth things over quietly. What she didn't understand was that I had barely started applying the exact same obsessive rule-following energy she spent months weaponizing against my grandmother. The strange thing about watching a power imbalance reverse itself is how quickly confidence starts leaking out of people once consequences become real. Patricia Holloway had spent months acting like HOA authority came from some invisible crown residents were expected to bow toward. But the moment procedural scrutiny entered the picture, everything changed. Emails turned cautious. Notices disappeared. Board communication suddenly emphasized community partnership instead of enforcement. Even neighborhood newsletters shifted tone, and that detail genuinely made me laugh because the same organization once obsessed with porch aesthetics somehow discovered empathy overnight. Amazing what happens when accountability quietly parks itself outside the clubhouse. 19. Meanwhile, I stayed disciplined and no dramatic speeches, no revenge fantasies, no public humiliation, just relentless compliance. That became the entire strategy. If Willow Creek loved rules, then perfect, every rule would finally matter. I submitted requests for maintenance verification schedules tied to trust easements, insurance renewals connected to shared land usage, entered review, landscaping modifications, touching common access corridors, required documentation, parking management obligations got audited, pathway expansion records resurfaced. Suddenly, years of overlooked shortcuts started crawling back into daylight. Bro, hearing how quickly stress spread through HOA leadership honestly blew my mind. Residents later described board meetings turning awkward fast. Apparently, discussions shifted away from mailbox colors and decorative fences toward phrases nobody wanted to hear. Liability exposure, procedural oversight, access review, operational interruption, contractual obligations. Funny how neighborhood dictators stop caring about grass height once real paperwork walks into the room. And the irony somehow kept getting better. Patricia, the woman who spent months acting like Grandma Evelyn represented neighborhood disorder, reportedly began pushing for calm and compromise. Neighbors quietly noticed the change. Her once overconfident energy softened into visible concern. Residents who had received minor violations suddenly stopped hearing from enforcement committees. People whispered about legal trouble. Anxiety spread. That part fascinated me, because power structures built on intimidation almost always collapse. The second fear changes direction. Before, residents feared paperwork. Now leadership feared paperwork. And that reversal? Absolutely unreal. Grandma still barely understood what was happening. She simply noticed life feeling lighter. Her medical transport resumed normally. Nobody stared anymore. No more tape notices. 20, no more strange visits. She even brought back little decorations to the porch one by one, which hit me harder emotionally than I expected. Seeing her cautiously place old flower pots back outside felt weirdly heartbreaking, because nobody should need courage, just to enjoy harmless pieces of normal life. That was the moment everything stopped feeling procedural for a second, and felt personal again. I remember standing near the porch, watching her straighten a weathered decoration Grandpa once made, thinking about how quietly older people absorb pressure. People underestimate psychological exhaustion, especially in elderly residents living alone. Nobody notices the shrinking until routines disappear. A chair gets removed, a decoration vanishes, a habit quietly stops. That realization stayed with me throughout everything. Still, accountability wasn't finished. The compliance audit results kept arriving. And wow, Messi barely described it. Years of inconsistent documentation surfaced. Landscaping work performed outside review conditions, maintenance reporting gaps, insurance inconsistencies attached to shared use responsibilities, pathway alterations, missing procedural approval, and little administrative shortcuts piled into something much uglier once combined. Nothing catastrophic individually, but collectively a nightmare for people pretending to worship standards. That's exactly how real world systems fail, by the way. Rarely through giant disasters, usually through accumulated arrogance and selective rule enforcement. Then came the moment Patricia truly understood leverage. A formal notice requested clarification regarding unauthorized modifications touching trust-connected land and advised temporary procedural review before future project approvals proceeded. Neutral wording, professional wording, but legally heavy? The kind of letter that quietly says, explain yourselves. Bro, hearing what happened afterward genuinely felt cinematic. 21, suddenly emergency meetings intensified. Consultants appeared, and residents saw unfamiliar vehicles near administrative offices. Rumors exploded. Neighborhood Facebook groups apparently transformed into suburban detective agencies overnight. People speculated about lawsuits, land sales, ownership disputes, hidden contracts, secret developers. Some theories sounded so dramatic they almost made me jealous I hadn't thought of them myself. And Patricia? And her behavior reportedly shifted again. Less authority, more urgency, more politeness, more procedural caution. Funny enough, residents started noticing something else too. Once scrutiny landed on leadership, complaint culture slowed dramatically. People relaxed. Porch decorations returned. Outdoor seating reappeared. Enforcement intensity mysteriously faded. That detail honestly said everything because it proved the rules had never really been about standards. They were about control. And once control became inconvenient, enforcement softened overnight. That realization blew my mind more than anything else. Eventually, through intermediaries and formal channels, the HOA requested collaborative review discussions surrounding future agreements and neighborhood governance cooperation. Suddenly, everyone cared about communication. Suddenly, mutual understanding mattered, and suddenly preserving relationships became important. That tonal shift deserved applause. Months earlier, Grandma supposedly represented disruption. Now, cooperation sounded beautiful, and that's exactly how people act when leverage enters the room. But the most satisfying part never came from stress, paperwork, or legal pressure. It came quietly one evening. I stopped by Grandma's house and found her sitting outside again. Outside, on the porch, watching birds. Wind chime back, old bench restored. Flowers returned. For the first time in months, she looked relaxed instead of worried. And man, that moment landed harder than I expected. 22, because revenge stories online always focus on victory, humiliation, dramatic takedowns, giant speeches. And real life feels different. Sometimes winning just means restoring peace someone unfairly lost. Still, I'd be lying if I said the malicious compliance energy wasn't incredibly satisfying. Watching an HOA obsessed with technicalities suddenly drown in technicalities, that was almost poetic. Patricia Holloway tried weaponizing bureaucracy against a disabled grandmother she assumed stood alone. Instead, she accidentally activated the one-person position to audit the very ground her authority rested on. That level of accidental self-destruction, incredible, and somehow, unbelievably, the story still wasn't over. By the time the dust started settling, Willow Creek Estates barely resembled the tense little pressure cooker neighborhood Grandma Evelyn had quietly endured for months. The dramatic energy faded first. Notices slowed to almost nothing. Enforcement language softened. And somehow, the same HOA that once treated tiny cosmetic issues like public emergencies suddenly discovered restraint. Funny how fast priorities shift when people realize every rule can travel both directions. Bro, watching that unfold honestly felt surreal because the transformation happened without shouting, threats, or public humiliation. Just paperwork, accountability, and the terrifying power of people finally reading. Contracts. The HOA eventually entered formal review discussions surrounding operational procedures, accessibility considerations, governance transparency, and compliance obligations tied to trust-connected land. Nobody publicly admitted wrongdoing, of course, because organizations almost never do. Instead, everything quietly changed. Accommodation language improved, and enforcement standards became clearer. Residents suddenly received friendlier notices emphasizing cooperation instead of intimidation. 23 community meetings reportedly felt less tense, less performative, and way less obsessed with microscopic control. Patricia Holloway, meanwhile, became noticeably quieter, according to neighbors. Not disgraced, not publicly destroyed, just different. Apparently, authorities stopped feeling fun once accountability started. Attending meetings, too. That detail genuinely fascinated me because people who love control rarely enjoy being examined with the same energy they once directed outward. But honestly, the part that mattered most had nothing to do with HOA politics. It was Grandma. Slowly, pieces of her normal life returned. Flower pots came back. The bench Grandpa built stayed outside again. Medical transportation visits stopped feeling embarrassing. Her little routines returned without apology. And one evening, sitting outside while sunlight hit the porch, she looked peaceful in a way I hadn't seen for months. That moment stayed with me because it quietly proved something important. Sometimes revenge is not destruction. Sometimes revenge is simply making sure the person who got pushed around finally feels safe again in the place they already belonged. 24. Looking back, this whole thing still feels unreal because it perfectly showed how tiny authority can spiral when nobody pushes back. Patricia Holloway thought paperwork made her untouchable, but bro, real life has a funny way of humbling people when forgotten details suddenly matter. And honestly, hearing how Grandma Evelyn slowly became herself again mattered more than every legal twist combined. That's exactly how people act in real life sometimes. Quiet pressure, polite intimidation, selective rules, until someone finally says enough. In the end, nobody got screamed at. Nobody got publicly destroyed. But accountability absolutely showed up, and that part, incredible. If this story shocked you, drop a comment with what you would have done in my place. And stick around for more HOA chaos, property drama, and revenge stories that feel way too real.